G20 Sherpas meeting gets underway in Washington without South Africa. The multilateral global organization finds itself at the mercy of unilateral decision-making after the Trump administration bans the only African member. But what consequences does the ban really have? And should the G20 continue with business as usual? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the G20. Well, if you hadn't heard about the G20 Sherpas and finance track meeting underway right now, you're not alone. The U.S. is hosting the summit with very little fanfare, and some argue that is by design. Not only does the Trump administration deride the multilateralism the G20 was founded on, but it's probably better not to draw attention to the controversial ban placed on South Africa. President Trump has accused the country of ignoring human rights abuses against South Africa's white minority and of weaponizing its leadership during its 2025 presidency. And so the summit proceeds without its key African member. Here's a look.
The G20 presidency has changed hands. But as Washington begins setting the agenda, one chair is already missing. On December 15th, the United States opened the G20 Sherpas meeting in Washington, where senior officials lay the groundwork and priorities for the G20 summit next year. The leaders are due to meet in Miami at a golf resort owned by President Donald Trump. But South Africa, the 2025 G20 host and the bloc's only African member, is not invited. The move marks a sharp departure from G20 practice and reflects a dispute that has been months in the making. The rift began earlier this year when President Trump accused South Africa's black majority government of persecuting its white minority. Pretoria moved quickly to push back, dismissing the allegations as false and politically motivated. Independent experts said there was no evidence to support the claims. And even within South Africa's Afrikaner community, the narrative failed to take hold.
We don't believe that there's something like a genocide happening in South Africa or anything like that. And I think we've, in our engagements with the American government, made that very much clear.
Despite the denials, Washington escalated, cutting aid, offering refugee resettlements to Afrikaners, and steadily downgrading diplomatic ties. The standoff came into full view last month, when South Africa hosted the G20 Leaders Summit in Johannesburg, the first ever held on African soil. The United States boycotted the summit, becoming the only G20 member without a senior-level presence. Despite that absence, the meeting concluded with a joint declaration focused on multilateral cooperation and global inequality. Washington later accused Pretoria of weaponizing its G20 presidency. And days later, President Trump announced South Africa would not be invited to next year's summit in the United States.
The propaganda of these false claims has real implications for our sovereignty, international relations, and national security. It is essential that we counter this narrative and defeat this agenda through direct and frank engagement, mobilizing broad support for the South African vision of non-racialism, reconciliation, and transformation.
But Washington has recast the dispute as a question of values, arguing that participation should depend on political alignment and not just membership.
The United States supports the people of South Africa, but not its radical ANC-led government, and will not tolerate its continued behaviour. When South Africa decides it has made the tough decisions needed to fix its broken system and is ready to rejoin the family of prosperous and free nations, the United States will have a seat for it at our table.
There's no formal mechanism for one G20 member to expel another, but as a host, the United States holds leverage and could effectively block participation by denying visas. As Washington reshapes the group in its own image, the question is no longer just about South Africa, but about whether a forum built on multilateral consensus can survive decisions made unilaterally.
Joining me now to speak further about the summit underway and the consequences of South Africa being banned from it are from Pretoria, geopolitical analyst and former South African diplomat Botsang Moiloa. From Chicago, chair of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. And from Baltimore, geopolitical analyst Lawrence Freeman. Thanks all so much for being with me. Moiloa, let's take a step back for just a minute and explain how we actually got here. How was one G20 member allowed to single-handedly ban another over unproven allegations of human rights abuses, if that's what it's really about?
Well, good afternoon, everybody and the panelists and the viewers. Let me start by saying it was just unfortunate that the United States of America, led by President Trump, to this age, and after South Africa's intervention and various reports about the suspicious or so-called genocide in South Africa and human rights in South Africa, which are not true, we saw during the visit of President Ramaphosa to the Oval Office that President Trump and the government or the administrative of the U.S., they started displaying pictures, grave sites from the DRC, as well as commemorative sites from South Africa. And they spoke of cleansing of the Afrikaners or the farmers in South Africa, which is not true. And then they go to an extent of boycotting the G20 based on that, and now banning South Africa, which is the founding member state of the G20. And I don't think it is correct for America to do that. They don't actually have the powers to can ban another member state. It's called the G20 for a reason, and go to an extent of inviting other countries like Israel as well as Poland who are not member states. It's unfortunate. South Africa's hands were wide open. South Africa was welcoming all member states equally, and America wanted to play the big brother of the G20. But you know what is surprising and worrying? It is the silence and lack of official communiques from other member states of the G20 to this extent. I don't know what are they waiting for, because if one of them is not there for a party, the party cannot proceed. When South Africa did not elect to boycott the G20 summit in the U.S., like the U.S. decided to boycott the G20 summit in South Africa. And I think the South African position is very clear. We remain members of the G20, and it is not up to the United States to determine who should be a member or not.
Okay. Moiloa, I have to be very honest with you. I'm having a lot of trouble hearing you, but hopefully your sound is coming clear through for our other guests. Let me ask Greg then, because again, if the foundation of the ban is built on these unproven allegations of, the persecution of a white minority in South Africa, does the U.S. really have the right to do this?
Well, I think there's some questions around, the allegations and how to prove them, but there's obviously a lot of activity going on. Whether it's proven absolutely in a court of law, I don't know, but I think it's pretty clear that there are human rights violations occurring. I've talked to witnesses, I've talked to people who've experienced it. So, but I think even beyond that, you look at the fact that, that when South Africa hosted G20 or in much of their communication, they're talking about, using the G20 to, as Marco Rubio said, to promote solidarity and sustainability and equality, which basically is code for DEI and net zero policies. And I think that's just shouldn't be the mission of the G20. So what I think the Secretary of State is doing is being clear that, we need to return the G20 to its core mission and talk about energy, guaranteeing or promoting energy, liberating the energy sector globally. Talk about, removing the regulatory burden from economies, from businesses, and then talking about new technologies, of course. But I think there's a lot of reasons to exclude South Africa besides the human rights violations.
So there's ideological differences here that you're talking about. But I mean, how many countries in the G20 would have those same ideological differences? Also, we haven't mentioned South Africa's policy on Gaza and how badly that has irritated the American and, Israeli lobby, particularly in the United States. Greg, how big of an issue is it really? Let's be honest. Is that what South Africa's being penalized for?
I don't doubt that. I think they don't talk about it in their public communications, but I think that surely could be an issue, and I think that's something that's really annoyed both the Secretary of State and the President. So yeah, there's a long list of issues that I think that both that the administration wants to kind of clean up and return the G20 to focusing on economic development and real wage growth.
Okay, Lawrence, I mean, yeah, what's really lost then if South Africa, isn't included? Does it actually leave Africa underrepresented now on the global stage? And is it really an affront to multilateralism altogether?
Thank you. It's actually an affront to the entire G20. First of all, the allegations against South Africa are false. There's not a single white farmer has been murdered and his land seized. And even the Afrikaner organizations have claimed that is true. So that's a false allegation. Two, is there's no mechanism in the G20 for one member to attack another member or declare another member cannot attend the summit. The G20, which now includes 19 countries, the European Union and the African Union, exist as a whole. There's no basis in the G20 summit for one country to exclude another, or one country, in this case, to invite another country in. Everything done in the G20 summit is done by consensus. So if the United States doesn't agree with the policy, they argue the policy, they discuss it, and they move on. But Trump has taken action that is unprecedented, and in fact, it's unclear if it even is possible. But the exclusion of South Africa, which was a founding member in 1999 of the G20, is an attack on Africa, which we've seen continually from the administration, and it's an attack on the global South. This is a country that has a rich history of fighting for freedom and development. Africa needs all the assistance it can get to develop its nations, and the fact that it's excluded will actually make the entire year of the U.S. chairmanship of the G20 summit will place it in doubt. Now, South Africa has asked other countries.
Sorry, I mean, does it though? Because the U.S. just keeps getting its way, Lawrence. I mean, getting its way. Does Trump, for example, get to have it both ways by staying involved in a multilateral organization, reaping its benefits, while also being allowed to make these unilateral decisions on behalf of that same organization?
Well, what's going on in the world right now, which the U.S. establishment and Trump in particular may not realize, is that the world is moving in a different direction. There multipolarity and the growing emergence of the global South and the BRICS countries, which is now 10 members and 10 partners. This is the emerging new reality of the world. Africa is going to have 2.5 billion people in 25 years, the largest workforce in the world. It's going to be the center of economic commerce. So the Western world and the rules-based order mentality is failing. And it's failing to recognize that there's a new world that's emerging. So Trump may exclude South Africa from attending the summit, but the rest of the world is seeing this. And in fact, China's come out with full support for South Africa against the United States action.
Yeah, we'd have to have a whole separate program again on the realignment of the world in general. But let me ask Botsang first. You mentioned that too many G20 members are not speaking up on the fact that South Africa has been banned. So South Africa has asked fellow G20 members to object to the ban, but not boycott, not boycott. So is that a powerful enough response?
I was saying it is powerful what South Africa has asked for. However, we are sitting in a situation whereby they should not boycott, but they should go into the G20 Sherpas meeting for preparation and raise the objection. There is a platform to can raise those objections. To go and boycott and or expel another country because you don't agree with the policy position they've put on the table or proposals that they put on the table, then what is a duty for a dialogue? Dialogue, it means exactly that. We come with our independent, separate proposals. We table them, and there's engagements, and where we don't agree or we don't reach consensus, there are mechanisms that are in place in the policy of the G20. But let me also take this opportunity and take the congressman or the Republican gentleman who's on the platform with us when he said he doesn't have records, doesn't have court records of whether there's genocide or human rights issues here. You know, Andrea, let me inform you of the official government statistics dated the 31st of March 2025, when the police reports of murder incidents in South Africa. In the year 2024-2025, which ended in March, the South African Police Service and courts are reporting that there were 8 farm murders. And out of the 8 farm murders, one, it was a spouse of a farmer, a white farmer, who killed his spouse. The other 2, it was white farmers which were killed by foreign nationals they had employed. Other 5 members out of the 8 of the killings in the farms were Black South African farm workers. So it is false. The statistics are there, the official records are there, and that cannot be the reason. The reason that South Africa is pushing for international solidarity, international cooperation, and working together diplomatically amongst member states of the world or of the G20, that is actually the South African policy position, foreign policy position, and there's nothing wrong with it. If America wants to turn it differently, they are welcome to do so. But to go and expel or bar one member state from participating, and we know the Geneva Convention as well as the G20 protocols, they are subscribing to say if you are the host, that you cannot deny visas to other member states to come and participate. That's because that's not your event, it is the G20 event. And I think the United States, they are very clear about this thing. I can tell you, Angela and the viewers, freely, this is all because of the South African government going to take Israel to the ICJ, and America is still very upset with that. We should also recall that the United States and South Africa diplomatic relations are strained. South Africa does not have an ambassador in the US. The US does not have an ambassador in South Africa for almost a year at the moment, understand? So this emanates from a build-up of strained bilateral diplomatic relations. But to say South Africa is not doing the right thing by stating its policy position, it cannot be like that in a diplomatic, a platform.
Okay, let me ask Greg then, how should members respond if they disagree with President Trump? Should there be a boycott? Or do you think these other leaders are in effect holding their breath until potentially Trump is out of office so they don't spend all their diplomatic capital right now on confronting the United States?
Well, I think the smart countries will actually follow the president's lead, and you're seeing that politically in the West. If you look at Western Europe right now, the parties of the right that are similar in tone and similar in policy to President Trump or to the Republican Party in the U.S. are moving to the right. All the parties of the right are leading in the polls right now in Western Europe, and you're seeing that with Vox in Spain. You're seeing it with AfD in Germany. You're seeing it with Reform in the United Kingdom. So I think that if the countries have their finger on the pulse of the voters, of the sentiment in their economies, and the rejection of overburdensome regulatory regimes, the rejection of net zero, they're going to if they do the right thing for their people, they will follow President Trump's lead and embrace this new G20 idea. So I think, if they're smart, they will not boycott. And if they want to make a comment, of course they can do that if they disagree with excluding South Africa. But I don't think there's any merit to ignoring their own people and not embracing the changes that are being recommended by the United States.
Greg, let me ask you, though, do you fear at all? I mean, you say that these other countries in the world in general is moving further to the right and is more actually ideologically aligned with the U.S. in that move. But is there not a risk through this complete lack of kind of diplomatic nature, especially going to the G20, that the U.S. really is isolating itself to a point that's going to backfire on the American people?
I don't think so. I mean, there's always that risk. I mean, this is in many ways, part of the common sense revolution. Obviously, the president's not a fan in general of multilateral organizations. He's critical of the EU, but he is a fan of some multilats, like NATO, where he's overseen vast improvement in in NATO and defense spending in Western Europe. So I think he wants to do the same thing with the G20. It can be a force for good if these countries allow their economies to liberate and to elevate, you know, the working people of those countries. And I think so. I think the mission is a good one, and I would hope that there isn't any, you know, serious pushback from the other members, because I think that would be self-defeating for their countries, not for the U.S.
Lawrence,
But if I may come in, Andrea,
quickly, Botsang, yeah.
Yes, just a quick. Why should it be countries that are right aligned and aligned to the US policies? Why is America wanting to impose what they believe in independent sovereign member state? What if other countries want a kind of mixed economy? At a moment where we are, the American economy is one of the worst performing in the world. And why should they impose that on countries like South Africa, which have economic policies that are developing, and even our relations with other countries in other blocks, in other regions, are improving better than what America is doing, and they want to impose their right-wing tendencies and policies on a country, a sovereign state like South Africa. I don't think that is diplomatic. I don't think actually it's respecting a sovereignty of a state.
Okay, let me get Lawrence back in, and I saw you laugh earlier at part of Greg's answer. Tell me why.
Well, the fact of the matter is that the reality is that Trump can exclude South Africa for this year, but next December, the chairmanship will go to England. So for 1 year, Trump can pretend that he's reforming the G20. He's not reforming the G20. He's actually violating the principle of the G20, which is consensus. So this is not a strategic move. This is not a thoughtful move. And many countries in the world, including in Africa, will see this as an attack on Africa, as you can also see in his national security strategy, where he ignores Africa almost completely. This is a strategic failure in thinking. What the United States should be doing is leading the world in economic development with a vision for the future, which includes South Africa and Africa and the G20. South Africa has been outspoken leader of Africa, both at the International Court of Justice, both in the BRICS and in the Global South and on the African continent. So this is not a smart move by the president. This is a stupid move by the president, which will have no positive effect, because in 1 year, the G20 will return to being a consensus organization, and there's no structure in the organization itself, in its founding principles, for anybody to be removed or added without agreement on the entire G20. So I don't see this as productive. I see this as self-defeating, and I wish my country would change its policy and think about a vision for the entire world, including the Global South, Africa, and the G20 in a more positive manner.
Okay, Lawrence, but I mean, this quickly, the vision of this administration is America first. It is more about protectionism than multilateralism. So they are carrying out that vision by effectively trying to derail an organization like the G20. The problem is, and this is what I was getting to, if it is done that way for the year to come, can it easily be undone? Whatever perhaps damage is incurred, can it easily be undone when the next chairman takes over? Or are we looking at permanent changes to be made?
The only changes that can be made in the G20 are by the G20 consensus. That's what's in the policy of the G20. China has already come out supporting South Africa. In fact, what Trump is doing, there's nothing wrong with American first as long as it understands the process of developing the rest of the world, which it doesn't. China right now is the one that's achieving the best results of this. More and more African countries, starting with South Africa, are going to look to China, and China is going to continue its very positive role in developing Africa, and the U.S. is isolating itself, and this will be reversed in 12 months. So it's not a sharp thinking, positive strategy that's going to change anything. South Africa will sit out this year, not being invited, and then next year will resume its rightful place in the G20. And there's nothing that President Trump can do about it.
Greg, quickly, I mean, you don't see this as short term as Lawrence does.
No, not at all. I think what President Trump's trying to do is improve the economies of the G20 countries. If he can, and that's something that you'll see a lot of the G20 countries follow. And again, liberate their economies, focus on energy, focus on deregulation. China supporting South Africa shouldn't surprise anyone. We all agree that China has become an adversary. It doesn't surprise me that they're in bed with South Africa. We've doubled the balance sheet at USDFC. We're investing a lot into Africa. The foreign direct investment is increasing in Africa, ex-South Africa. It's very hard for both commercial and development financial institutions to invest in South Africa because of their BEE policies, because of their focus on climate change and DEI instead of on liberating their economy.
Botsang, very quick final words.
Just a quick one from my side. I don't think there will be any significant impact in this year's G20 the next 12 months, because I think, and I suspect that there's going to be a silent boycott. Member states, the other 18 member states will attend. They will not reach consensus about whatever America is going to put on the table, and then the matter will move next year to the United Kingdom, and South Africa will be back on the table, and the G20 will then start looking at the formal policies that are binding to everybody that have reached consensus. I don't think many of the things that the USA is going to propose, there will never be consensus on those proposals.
That will then have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.